Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking into Chad. It's a country you don't always hear a lot about, but its story is really intricate, really compelling.
It absolutely is.
And our mission, like always, is to take this stack of sources, research, articles, notes, and pull out the key insights. Basically give you a shortcut to being really well informed about Chad.
Exactly. And Chad is often, well, misunderstood.
Yeah.
Its story has so many layers. The geography, the history, external pressures, they've all shaped this unique identity.
Full of contrasts, it sounds like.
Definitely. And incredible resilience, too.
So the big question is, what can we uncover from all this material about Chad's past, its present challenges, and maybe even where it's headed? Okay, let's get into it. First off, the sheer scale of the place. Chad is huge.
One of Africa's giants, yeah.
Over 1.2 million square kilometers. That makes it, what, the fifth largest on the continent?
That's right. And the geography itself is incredibly varied. You've got mountains, highlands, vast sand dunes, and then that really significant Sahelian belt running through the middle.
So a land of contrasts physically, too.
And that directly links to really extreme differences in climate.
How extreme?
Well, think about rainfall. You might get as little as 300 millimeters in the north.
Okay, very dry.
But then head southeast, and it jumps to maybe 3,000 millimeters.
Wow, that's a massive difference. What drives that?
A big part of it is the Intertropical Convergence Zone, the ITCZ. It's that weather band near the equator. That plus moisture coming in from the Atlantic.
And that affects Lake Chad.
Critically.
Yeah.
It dictates the whole flooding and drying cycle of the lake. And Lake Chad itself, well, it's the largest inland water body in West Africa. Sort of a meeting point for the Sahara and the tropics.
And it borders several countries, doesn't it?
5 in total surround it: Nigeria, Chad itself, Cameroon, and the Central African Republic.
So, given those dynamics, that fluctuating, just how vital is it for the whole area?
Oh, it's fundamental. Absolutely foundational. It's a lifeline for millions of water, for farming, fishing, supporting ecosystems.
Not just for Chad, then.
Not at all. Its fluctuations, its health, directly impact livelihoods and stability right across the region. Think food security. Think potential conflict over resources. It's that important.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Pre-colonial Chad. The sources paint a picture of, well, constant conflict.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme. Before Europeans arrived, you had these autonomous kingdoms: Wadai, Kanem, Borno, or some names that pop up.
And they were often at war.
Constantly, it seems. You also had different groups, farmers like the Buduma and Kotoko near Lake Chad, and then pastoralists like the Zagawa and Gorain moving with their herds. Tribal warfare was just endemic.
Then the Arabs arrived in the 7th century. How did that change things?
Profoundly. They introduced the camel.
Which revolutionized trade, I imagine?
It did, but it also tragically ramped up the intensity and scale of warfare, made it much more brutal.
And they brought Islam.
Yes, Islam and Arabic writing spread. By the 11th century, Islam was largely accepted. This helped surrounding kingdoms grow more powerful, bringing wealth, yes, but also slaves and significant cultural shifts.
So this early period established a pretty complex social structure.
Very complex. You had Arab, Berber, Tuareg traders, and religious figures sort of at one level. Then you had distinct groups of labor slaves and their families, all overlaying this predominantly pagan past before Islam really took hold.
The seeds of division seem planted very early on.
You could certainly argue that.
Which brings us to the French arrival in the 1890s. They subjugated Chad, divided it up.
Into 3 colonies, yes. And the key thing the sources stress is that French colonialism here was about exploitation, not assimilation. Meaning France was mainly interested in Chad for raw materials and, frankly, cheap, unskilled labor. They didn't really institute policies to unify the territory or modernize it in any meaningful way.
Just resource extraction.
Pretty much. For over 40 years, Chad was severely neglected. Minimal investment in modern education and health facilities.
And I read something about conscription.
Yeah, they conscripted unskilled labor, but exempted the educated few, which just deepened existing divides. It was treated, as one source puts it, like a neglected backwater of French equatorial Africa.
That's stark. And didn't the British observe something similar?
They did. A British report noted that after nearly 35 years of French rule, the colony was practically unchanged.
Wow.
And the first Chadians sent to represent the territory in France, generally described as illiterate and unsuited. It really shows the level of neglect.
So this arbitrary French rule fragmented the state further.
Absolutely. It contributed to its complex structure, yes, but more importantly, the lack of unifying policies just made those existing tribal divisions worse. Remember, these groups didn't really have a concept of Chad as a single nation before the Europeans.
And the consequences of this neglect were severe and long-lasting.
Terribly so. We see the rise of Islamic terrorism later, banditry, human trafficking becoming serious issues.
And Chad became isolated internationally for a time, a pariah state.
Yes, after aligning with Libya against Sudan, that didn't help. And you read about specific awful incidents, like a bandit attack in '96 where 100 people were murdered.
And the trafficking issue, particularly women from the South.
A deeply concerning trend, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Women migrating, sometimes ending up in prostitution rings in Europe. It really makes you ask, how much did that colonial legacy, the division, the underdevelopment, create these vulnerabilities that are still playing out today?
It feels like a direct line from that neglect to the chaos after independence. Chad became independent August 11th, 1960.
But the sources are blunt. Immediate chaos. Ethnic warfare erupted almost instantly.
Why so fast?
Well, look at the first National Assembly elections in 1959, just before independence. There was no real national development plan on the table.
It was all based on ethnicity.
Purely ethnic or regional discrimination. This created massive distrust between the largely Arab-speaking North and the non-Afro-Asiatic-speaking South.
A recipe for instability.
Exactly. And it led pretty quickly to President Francois Tombalbaye establishing quite an authoritarian rule.
Until his assassination in '75.
Correct. The bigger picture here is that initial failure to build any national unity just paved the way for decades of conflict.
As one source said, ethnic adventure delayed all national development programs. Just paralyzed the country from the start.
Tragically, yes.
And that instability quickly became actual civil war, the first civil war in 1965 to '79.
Right. That pitted Frolinat, the National Liberation Front of Chad, which got help from Libya against the government.
And it was brutal.
Extremely. Thousands killed, hundreds of thousands displaced. By the mid-'70s, Frolinat controlled almost half the country.
What about other outside powers? France, the U.S.?
Their roles were incredibly complex. Often, as the sources say, confusingly both allies and enemies.
Supporting different sides at different times.
Or their support was ambiguous. Their actions often reflected wider Cold War or regional power plays more than a clear strategy for Chad itself. It was a long, bloody mess with murky allegiances.
Libya eventually left in '89, and there is a peace accord.
Yes, but the cost to Chad was immense.
Which then leads to Idriss Déby taking power in a military coup in 1990.
Right, and initially, his government saw a bit of a calmer period.
Why was that?
Partly thanks to increasing oil revenue starting to come in, plus international support. So for about a decade, there was less rebel conflict compared to before.
But the underlying issues didn't disappear.
Not at all, they festered. And by 2006, things escalated again. Serious political challenges, including rebel attacks right on the capital and N'Djamena.
Déby fought them off.
He did, sometimes with significant French military help. But it showed how fragile things still were.
And even during the calmer periods under Déby, the sources mention ongoing problems.
Persistent issues, yes. Widespread frustration among young people about unemployment. Government repression met with police brutality. And consistent allegations of corruption swirling around the regime.
So, a surface stability masking deeper discontent.
That seems a fair assessment.
Okay, let's talk economics. Chad is described as a place of extreme situation. Rich potential,
But terrible conditions of survival for many. That contrast is key.
And then oil was discovered, late '80s, early '90s. Production starts in 2003. That must have seemed like a game changer.
Oh, absolutely. It promised enormous financial and economic changes, and the potential scale was huge.
How much money are we talking about?
Over about 20 years, Chad received somewhere in the region of U.S. $45 billion from oil projects and revenues.
$45 billion for a country with such low GDP per capita.
Exactly. It could have been utterly transformative. The World Bank even backed the main pipeline project.
But with conditions, right?
Very specific conditions. The money had to be used to reduce extreme poverty and managed transparently. This led to Chad actually passing a law, Law 001, specifically for managing oil revenue.
So the framework was there. What actually happened to the money? Did it lift people out of poverty?
Well, tragically, the sources point to absurd misspending. Money diverted into narcotics, arms deals, fueled by corruption among the political elite.
Despite the law and the World Bank's conditions.
Despite the law. And then oil prices fluctuated wildly, which led to huge government deficits and mounting debt. Things got so bad, the IMF canceled debt rescheduling, and even the country's largest domestic bank failed.
So the oil wealth didn't trickle down?
Largely, no. It illustrates a huge gap between wealth and poverty. You read about legendary prices for basic things like flour, while billions are flowing in at the top, and growth across other economic sectors remains stubbornly low.
A classic resource curse.
A textbook example, sadly.
And all this is happening in a country where agriculture is still the absolute backbone.
Absolutely. About 72% of the population works in agriculture. Livestock is huge for GDP, for exports.
But farming there must be incredibly difficult. You mentioned the climate extremes.
It is. They battle poor, often saline soils. Prolonged droughts are common in the Sahel and Sahara zones, and then you get annual floods elsewhere.
It sounds relentless.
Which is why Chad has, as one source puts it, a tragically deserved reputation as one of the world's most food-insecure countries. Acute malnutrition rates have reached as high as 27%.
27%, that's staggering.
It's a constant struggle against these environmental odds.
And then you add climate change on top of that.
Which hits Chad particularly hard. It's the largest Sahel country, and the Climate Change Vulnerability Index rates it as extreme risk.
And the most visible symbol of this is Lake Chad itself.
Chillingly so. It used to be the sixth largest lake in the world, 25,000 square kilometers.
And now?
Now it's shrunk to around 1,500 square kilometers, maybe even less sometimes.
1,500 from 25,000.
Yes, it's become this global symbol of environmental degradation. It's literally disappearing in front of our eyes.
That's terrifying.
And it's not just the lake. Temperatures are rising consistently across the country. N'Djamena saw a 2.65 degrees Celsius increase just between 1950 and 2014.
So the climate crisis isn't some future threat for Chad.
No, it's right now. It's devastating.
Yet despite all this, the conflict, the economic woes, the environmental crisis, there's this other side. Chad as a museum of Africa.
Yes, it's fascinating. This points to its incredibly deep history, maybe 3,000 years old, and this amazing cultural richness.
Shaped by different influences.
Exactly. Sources talk about three civilizational blocks: indigenous African, Arab, and later Western influences all converging there.
And that means incredible diversity.
Profound diversity. Linguistically, ethnically. Estimates are around 140 distinct peoples, over 120 languages spoken.
Wow. Is that diversity a source of strength?
It absolutely is a source of incredible heritage. But the flip side, as we've seen, is that this diversity has also been exploited politically and militarily. It's fueled conflict, displacement.
And there's social stratification, too.
Deep-seated cultural stratification, yes. Traditions, customs, etiquette, rites of passage, they vary hugely across the country but remain incredibly important. It's a complex social fabric.
But the culture itself is vibrant.
Very much so. Expressed through dance, music, a strong tradition of oral literature, narrative songs, folktales, often performed at community events using all sorts of traditional instruments. It shows amazing resilience.
Are there efforts to preserve this?
Yes, there are some positive steps. Laws have been passed for cultural protection and promotion, and there's hope that moves towards private radio and TV, away from just state control, could help stabilize music creation and sharing.
What about Chad on the world stage, its international relations?
They generally reflect a non-aligned stance. Chad tries to maintain cooperation regionally and internationally.
So, decent relations with neighbors?
Yeah.
And powers like France?
Generally, yes. Warm ties with many African and Arab states. Friendly relations with France, Libya, the U.S. too. They cooperate on important issues, like fighting extremism in the Sahel.
And peacekeeping.
They've participated in missions in Darfur and the Central African Republic, for instance, so trying to be an active player.
But zooming back in, internally, the challenges persist despite some reforms.
Definitely. Peace accords happened in the early 2000s. There were democratic constitutional reforms on paper. But human rights are still often restrained. Protests get cracked down on. There have been internet disruptions.
So stabilization is still fragile.
Very fragile. It really depends on developing those resources more equitably and, crucially, preventing armed groups from challenging the transitional administration that's currently in place. It's a tough path.
And there's a chilling reminder of the past conflicts still present. Landmines.
A truly sobering detail. A survey back in 2000 estimated maybe 1 million landmines, plus hundreds of thousands of other unexploded bombs still affecting nearly 200 communities.
1 million landmines.
Still out there. That was the estimate. And the National Mine Action Center, the body supposed to clear them, is reported as being severely underfunded. It's a deadly legacy that lingers.
So we've really journeyed through this intricate tapestry that is Chad, from ancient kingdoms, the diverse and challenging geography,
Through the deep scars left by colonialism, those repeating cycles of civil war.
and the ongoing struggles with the economy, the environment, the resource curse.
But we've also seen this incredible cultural richness, this resilience of the Cherokee people who are determined to find their way despite it all.
It's powerful.
It really is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to think about. This is a nation where, apparently, the very idea of its constitution has been debated, where someone once lamented that any tête-à-tête without France is unthinkable. What's it actually going to take for Chad to achieve lasting peace, real prosperity, a truly shared national vision?
Can it move beyond the shadows of its past conflicts, beyond the specter of that disappearing lake, and really chart its own course?
A profound question.
We really encourage you to keep exploring Chad's story, its culture, the spirit of his people navigating these immense challenges, and maybe consider how their story connects to bigger global issues we all face.